Alright guys, so we will pick up right here with the Declaration of Independence. We're talking June 1776 at the Second Continental Congress. So you need to realize that they'd been fighting the American Revolution for over a year at this point. We know Thomas Jefferson drafted the document, and some big ideas in the document were egalitarianism. That's this word right here, okay? And that's the concept that all men are created equal. We also have the idea of inalienable rights, or those natural rights that the government can't take away from anyone. And then lastly, in the document itself, it is concluded or ended with a list of complaints against the king. The Declaration of Independence eventually laid the groundwork for the Constitution, okay, as did all of these other ideas and foundations of our representative government, okay? That's sort of where we're headed. So back to Lexington and Concord, and we are talking Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, guys. In April 1775 is the date we are specifically talking about, or the time frame. British troops were on their way to seize arms and ammunition at Concord when they were met in Lexington by colonial militia. Colonial militia are volunteer fighters, okay? This is what we deem the shot heard around the world that sort of sparked and started the American Revolution, okay? So, in the American Revolution, you have the Loyalists versus the Patriots, okay? The Loyalists are those people that wanted to remain loyal to the crown, okay, as in England, whereas the Patriots are those colonists who supported the Revolution, okay? George Washington was the commander of the Continental Army, and thus a patriot, okay? So the war in the North, we're going to focus on two key battles of the American Revolution that happened in the North. The first is the Battle of Saratoga in New York. That was September 1777. It was a Continental or U.S. Army victory, okay? It was led by General Horatio Gates. And guys, this battle is important because it is the one that convinced the French that these colonists might be able to win this war, okay? It convinced them that we might have the willpower to actually win, and thus the French forged an alliance with the colonists because of this, right? We're also going to look at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, okay, guys? And the particular points of this one you need to know are that it was just a very harsh winter with very low supplies, and that a lot of men died in this battle because of sickness, okay? Alright, now moving on to the war in the South. We've talked about the Palmetto flag. You'll see it here in this corner. I just wanted to go ahead and mention that you know that this is sort of where our flag originated from, or what we paid tribute to the American Revolution. In our South Carolina state flag, the Palmetto flag, the color is indigo because that was one of our big crops during this time period, but also we put the palmetto tree on there mainly because when they were trying to siege Charleston, colonists used the trunks of the palmetto tree to block the cannons from coming in, and those cannons actually bounced off, and thus that is why Charleston was not captured the first time, okay? So that is the South Carolina state flag. A little history for you. But again, we've already talked about that a little more in depth. But either way, moving on. War in the South. The British under General Cornwallis had seized Savannah and Charleston, and were seeking to invade North Carolina, okay? So eventually they did get Charleston. The British were defeated, however, at Kings Mountain and Cowpens, and those are both in South Carolina, you should be familiar with. And this was considered the turning point of the war, particularly in the South, okay? And it inspired guerrilla warfare forces, led by Francis Marion. You know him, the Swamp Fox, okay? So again, turning point of the war, Kings Mountain and Cowpens, alright? Cornwallis eventually did get to invade North Carolina, however, and he then chased the Continental Army north into Virginia, alright? And then in Yorktown, Virginia, the British, were trapped on the peninsula, and the French provided a naval blockade, in the water, thus, because it's a naval blockade, right? Using the Navy to blockade other ships, or block other ships from being able to come in and provide these British soldiers with supplies, or to even evac them out of there, okay? So we were on one side, the French and their Navy were on the other side blocking anyone from helping the British, okay? Thus, Cornwallis surrendered to Washington at this point, and guys, that was the informal end of the American Revolution, okay? The formal end did not come until 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Alright, so the Articles of Confederation. Guys, we are now free from the British. We are our own sovereign country. So now we got to figure out how to rule it, okay? Our first attempt were the Articles of Confederation, okay? Those are our first set of laws. It was ratified in 1781. And as we have talked about numerous times, the Articles of Confederation failed because it didn't give enough power to the federal government, okay? Not the state government, the big federal government, okay? National or central government, whichever term you want to use, okay? Thus, the Founding Fathers met in 1787 to revise these articles, but they instead realized it was just terrible and instead threw it out completely, scrapped it, and began from working on the Constitution. Alright, the Great Compromise. So, we've talked about this numerous times as well, okay? We had the Virginia Plan versus the New Jersey Plan, okay? It was the large state plan versus the small state plan, okay? Both of which were proposed, both of which advocated for 3 branches of government, a legislative, executive, and judicial, right? You know, the legislative makes the laws, the executive enforces them, and the judicial interprets them, okay? The key difference between these two plans, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, were how that legislative branch was made up, okay? The Virginia Plan, or the large state plan, wanted the 2 houses of the legislative branch to have representation based on population, right? Because they were larger states. They had larger populations. So they wanted their representation based on population because that would give them an advantage in the lawmaking branch of our government, okay? Whereas the New Jersey Plan, they said, look, we don't have nearly as many people in our state. We don't have that population, right? We're going to be tumbled over. So we want representation that's equal for everyone, okay? They wanted everyone to have one vote on everything, okay? We eventually came to the Great Compromise, which we know of because it still exists today, right? Where we do have a legislative, executive, and judicial branch, but that legislative branch is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, all right? That is our legislative branch or our Congress, right? And in Congress, the Senate followed the New Jersey Plan where everyone has an equal amount of representation, guys. In the Senate, every state gets 2 votes, all right? 2 senators. But we also have the House, the other branch, or the other house, and it more so followed the Virginia Plan where representation is based on population, all right? A state like California has many more votes in the House of Representatives than a small state like Wyoming or Delaware, something like that. All right, and that settlement was called the Great Compromise. All right, some other compromises of the Constitutional Convention. We have the 3/5 Compromise, okay? So another argument during this time period was the issue of slavery, okay? The North said that slaves should not be counted in the population. Whereas the South argued that they did, or that they should be, because, well, obviously they had a lot more slaves in the South, right? And if you were allowing those slaves to be counted in the population, then that would mean that those states that had a lot of slaves would also have more representation in the legislative branch, which would make them more powerful, okay? North didn't want that. The South was all for it. It was important to the House of Representatives, remember, because that's the branch that is based on population. But the ultimate decision was that each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person. All right. Then we also have the Slave Trade Compromise, guys. Northerners said that they would allow the slave trade to continue for 20 more years because the South claimed that their entire economy depended on it. And the South guys ultimately just agreed to that time frame because it essentially bought them some time to figure it out, okay? They said, look, we'll take what we can get for now, and then when the deadline starts approaching in 20 years, then we'll figure out how to extend it somehow, although that would not happen. All right, and then we have the Bill of Rights, which was another compromise. The Bill of Rights that phrase refers to Amendments 1 through 10. And guys, those were added to protect individual rights from government overreach because you had a large group of people, particularly those that we would deem today as anti-federalists, who were fearful of a very strong national government. And so they wanted these Bill of Rights added in there before they were ratified in order to protect individual freedoms. All right, it's also time to talk about Washington. Guys, in his farewell address when he left office, he very much stressed the importance of staying away from political parties, okay? He said that if you allow political parties to form, it was going to weaken our government, and that could not happen, okay? So, again, if you remember anything about George Washington's presidency, please remember that in his farewell speech, he warned against the dangers of political parties, okay? And then, of course, it happened, okay? One of the first emergent differences, one turns into a little political party, but either way, the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, okay? The Federalists are sometimes referred to as Hamiltonians. Those are the people that wanted a strong central government, okay? They supported the Constitution. They were all for a powerful government. They wanted a very loose interpretation of the Constitution. They wanted that wiggle room to allow them to do whatever they needed to. And ultimately, these were some prime examples of Federalists were the people that wrote the Federalist Papers, okay? That was Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. And remember, the Federalist Papers were those 85 essays convincing people to ratify the Constitution. And then on the opposite side, we have your Jeffersonians or your Anti-Federalists. Remember, anti is against a federalist and or federal government. They were the people that wanted stronger state governments, okay? Rather than the national government having all the power, they wanted decisions to be left up to the states, all right? And in turn, these people had a strict interpretation of the Constitution. No wiggle room. If it did not say it in black and white that the federal government could do it, then there was no way around it, okay? The federal government could only do what it explicitly said in the Constitution and nothing else. All right, please make sure you look over these charts of the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, okay? The Anti-Federalists would turn into the Democratic Republican Party, all right? Obviously, Jefferson's party, you see I have Jefferson and Hamilton under their corresponding parties. Please look this over, okay? But for time's sake, we got to move on. All right, so the conflicts between the two parties, we have the Naturalization Act, the Alien Act, and the Sedition Act, okay? These were all things that Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans saw as abuses of power of the federal government, all right? The Naturalization Act required 14 years of residency before you could become a citizen. The Alien Act said the government could arrest you, detain, or remove any foreigners that they thought were untrustworthy. And then the Sedition Act ultimately limited free speech and expression during this time period, okay? They continued with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that stated if a state believed a federal law to be unconstitutional, then it did not have to obey or enforce that law, okay? Ultimately, we're talking about the doctrine of nullification, and that claims that states can nullify a national law that they believe violated the Constitution, okay? Guys, eventually with the end of the War of 1812, the Federalist Party faded out of existence, okay? And we will talk about that as we move on into the next unit, okay? But some important principles of the Constitution, the idea of republicanism, or that members of an elite leadership class represent all the members of a society. But guys, even though we were founded on this idea of republicanism, that eventually gave way to the principle of democracy in the Constitution, or the fact that people should be able to elect their leaders more directly, okay? We also have the principle of the separation of powers. You're familiar with that. I shouldn't have to explain that there is no one powerful being, right? The president is he doesn't hold all the power, right? He doesn't make the laws and enforce them. They have their own separation of those powers, okay? Also, the principle of checks and balances. You know what that is. Each branch can check the other ones. We have the concept of federalism, or the fact that two levels of government are sharing power, both the state and the federal government, right? So if you're in the state of South Carolina, you have to listen to state laws as well as federal laws. Okay, some sections of the Constitution, guys. We have the preamble, which is the first sentence that explains the purpose. The first article that establishes the legislative branch in the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Article 2 establishes the executive branch, and Article 3 establishes the judicial branch, okay, guys? Precedents is the fact that the courts use past legal decisions to make rulings because the law is open to interpretation. And then Marbury versus Madison in 1803, under Chief Justice John Marshall, judicial review was established, okay? And that's the court's power to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional, okay? And then last but not least, and I'm sorry I'm rushing through this, but the Bill of Rights, Amendments 1 through 10 of the Constitution, you need to make sure you review these as well for your end of course test, okay? So I know that was very quick, but please, please, please rewatch